I've been through bad elections before, and I wanted to put some perspective on this one, my perspective on it anyway, and I go back to an era before many of you were born, before you even a concept, which is 1968 election, which was my first presidential election. I was 21 years old then. I wasn't much for Vice President Hubert Humphrey because he and Lyndon Johnson were the war party back then. My candidate, my first political hero, Robert Kennedy, had been murdered that spring. However, I was strongly opposed to the Republican, Richard Nixon. I was deeply committed to opposing the United States war in Vietnam. Richard Nixon and his political hatchetmen were bitterly opposed to us. His Vice President, Spiro T. Agnew, called us, quote, nattering nabobs of negativism. We were called un-American, traitors to our country, and they turned the powers of the federal government against us. I was tracked and wiretapped by the FBI, audited by the IRS, subpoenaed and brought before a federal grand jury, and pursued by my draft board using techniques that were later ruled unconstitutional in federal court. It was later revealed that I was the only Minnesotan among several hundred political activists who had been placed by the White House upon Richard Nixon's famous enemies list, which I've always said is still one on my tombstone. But my experiences taught me to stand up, speak out, and act on my beliefs, and to unite in common cause with other activists. I'll never forget the March on Washington in November 1969. Over 500,000 people gathered along the mall up to the Lincoln Memorial and demanded an end to the Vietnam War. We were tear gassed and some were beaten. The following May, after the invasion of Cambodia, we descended upon Washington again. This time there were even uglier confrontations with government forces. Later that month, I returned to Minnesota and joined the Honeywell Project's first demonstration at the company's annual meeting, where I voted to remove my father and the Honeywell other board of directors for supporting the manufacture of deadly anti-personnel bombs that were maiming thousands of innocent civilians in Southeast Asia. It led to some interesting discussions around the family dinner table. But that day we were assaulted by Minneapolis police on horseback after someone later identified as an FBI agent or provocateur threw a rock and broke Honeywell's glass front entrance. But we stayed united and devoted to our cause, and the tide turned. Public opinion grew slowly but surely against the war. Richard Nixon was forced to resign to avoid being impeached. Spiro Agnew pleaded, quote, nolo contendere, close quote, to avoid prison. Several of their top lieutenants were convicted and served prison terms. The people who had called us anti-American criminals, it turned out that they were the criminals. And those experiences caused me to shift away from direct social services to government staff positions and from activism outside the political mainstream to campaigns within it. In those young, idealistic years, I actually believed that my generation would transform our nation and our world, that we would end the nuclear arms race, eradicate world hunger, eliminate the social and economic inequalities in our own country, and clean up the planet, among other things. And we'd achieve all of this in time to spend our final years meditating and achieving Sartori. Needless to say, it didn't turn out that way. My generation, I'm ashamed to say, is leaving much of our country and our world in worse shape than we inherited it. Certainly we've achieved some tremendous successes, even transformative breakthroughs. Marriage equality comes first to mind. Elected an African-American president and almost elected a woman president. Earth Day and the resulting consciousness about protecting our priceless and fragile natural resources. Yet we have also failed in hugely important ways. Racial discrimination, religious bigotry, and unchecked violations of essential human rights are even worse than before. I recently appointed a wonderful Ramsey County attorney to the Hennepin County District Court, the first, to our knowledge, Muslim woman of Muslim faith to be appointed to Minnesota court. And we asked her if we could, make that fact known, since it was an historic first. And she thought about it and then came back and said that she would appreciate if we didn't do that because her mother and father moved to Minnesota State, Mankato, and he was a professor there in the early 1960s. And she said the racial and religious bigotry is worse now than it was back in the 1960s when they first arrived. And a woman who had been appointed, a Muslim woman who had been appointed to a judicial position in New York just a few days before, was receiving death threats. That's our failure. And in the current social environment led by a president who relishes his own incivility, who's leading the normalization of hate speech throughout our society, things are likely to get even worse before they start to get better. So how do we respond to these looming storms threatening to engulf our country? How do we limit their damage and lay the foundation for the reemergence of the best American virtues and values and of the public policies that reflect them? As it was for me in 1968, our basic choice is between apathy and activism. I know many people, especially younger people, who are so distraught and discouraged, even demoralized by the outcome of the recent election, that they're considering giving up on our political process. Just as some of my first anti-war comrades in 1967 and 68 chose to tune in and drop out. I think that would be a terrible mistake. Lech Walesa was the leader of the Free Poland movement back in 1990, and he said, quoted once, I heard him say, a Polish proverb, "Do not fear your enemies, at worst they will kill you. Do not fear your friends, at worst they will betray you. But beware of the indifferent ones. It is with their silent consent that murder and tyranny exist in the world." That's why I think we need to respond to the call of activism. Activism means going headlong and full force into that coming storm, being willing to endure the turbulence which it will bring, accepting the disruptions and difficulties we will bring into our own lives by our standing up, speaking out, and living our truths. Winston Churchill said, "If you're going through hell, keep on going. Only if we persevere can we possibly prevail." This storm will finally pass. Nixon and Agnew, as I said, were forced to resign. Majority public sentiment turned slowly against the Vietnam War. And I don't want for a minute to minimize the cost of that debacle. As with the passing of a severe storm, there was terrible damage left behind. A massive, time-consuming and expensive cleanup was required, and some costs to lives, to families, and social systems could never be redeemed. But one of the good features of activism in our very diverse society is that there are many good options for involvement. Activism does not require everyone here to drop their current occupations and run for the state legislature or Congress or President of the United States, although I would certainly encourage you to do so. Teachers and other educators will be needed to thwart the reactionary proposals now being advanced by some politicians. The adverse impacts of state and federal policy changes and funding cuts on recipients of our social services are best described and decried by people involved in providing those services. There are so many avenues to impacting important public policies as city council members, school board officials, citizens advisory groups, and advocates organizations. What is required to have a chance for success is for all of us to get involved, to redouble our resolve, to take our stands, and to unite with like-minded allies to increase our impact. Some people ask, what difference does it make? What difference can I make? The key is to make a difference, to make your difference in your own unique way. As Robert Kennedy said, quote, "Each time a man or woman stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, she sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current that can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance." And my surprise at the end of a lifetime of public involvement and social activism has been that the biggest beneficiary of all my efforts has been myself. I've received far more than I've given. From the incredible people I've met, to the exceptional places I've been, the extraordinary experiences I've had, and to the personal growth that my path has required of me. I'm a recovering alcoholic, and I know that if I didn't have this higher purpose in my life, I'd be lying drunk in some gutter. Instead, I've had the chance to play a small part, however insignificant and unsuccessful, in some of the great dramas of my lifetime. So as I prepare to look back on my career in public service when it concludes 2 years from now, I know that I will be disappointed by what I failed to accomplish, but I won't be disappointed in what I tried to accomplish. And it's that trying every day, through good days and bad, through successes and failures, through progress and regression, and then getting up the next day to try again. That's been the secret to my salvation, as it will be to yours. As John Kennedy said better than I, the credit belongs to the man or the woman who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, and spends himself or herself in a worthy cause. But best, if she wins, knows the thrills of high achievement, and if he fails, at least fails daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. So my request to all of you who are graduates here to take the talents, to take the experience you gain, and recommit yourself to social activism in whatever form you choose. But the country and the world needs your talent. We need it now more than ever before. And as I said, you'll be the beneficiaries if you continue the commitment you've already shown with your lives and your careers. Now, 12 years ago, as Y said, I gave the commencement speech at the very first MAPL graduation. Since then, I've been haunted by the question, why haven't I been invited back? Was it something I said? So great was my relief when this invitation arrived. And even greater was my excitement when I learned that this would be Y's final graduation ceremony as the founder and leader of this wonderful program. MAPL would not have begun, it would not have succeeded, except for Y's extraordinary dedication and his many talents. Look at the roster of today's graduates, and of his previous graduates, and of his faculty. It's a preeminent program in every way, and I thank Metropolitan State University for giving it a home. As I said before, anybody knows why knows his greatest blessing has been his wonderful wife, Marcia Abner. I know that this adventure has been a true partnership, so thank you, Marcia. And thank you, Y. And in recognition of your superb achievement and of your tireless devotion to make Minnesota a better place for everyone, it's my honor to proclaim today, December 10th, 2017, as Y Spano Day throughout the state of Minnesota. I'm sorry to have to leave. The factual correction is Bob Dylan will not be in Hibbing, at least as far as... but of course, he's not going to get the Nobel Prize either, so I can't be too offended. But I'm glad to be here, proud to be with you all, and congratulations to all of you graduates. Carry on.